welcome to Bible Branch. My name is Tim Fisher. This is one of the adult classes that are being taught this morning, and the other one is downstairs with Brother Tony Lawrence teaching Proverbs. We have been studying Hebrews and for 2.5 months, and I think we're going to make it to chapter 5 today. We're moving along quickly. Before we start our study, I'm going to have a song, and Brother Ethan is going to lead us in that song. What's your number, Ethan?
684. 684. Sing the first and last verse. This world is not my home, I'm just a passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue. The angels beckon me from heaven's open door, and I can't feel at home in this world anymore. Oh Lord, you know I have no friend like you. If heaven's not my home, then Lord, what will I do? The angels beckon me from heaven's open door, and I can't feel at home in this world anymore. Just up in glory land we'll live eternally. The saints on every hand are shouting victory. Their songs of sweetest praise drift back from heaven's shore, and I can't feel at home in this world anymore. Oh Lord, you know I have no friend like you. If heaven's not my home, then Lord, what will I do? The angels beckon me from heaven's open door, and I can't feel at home in this world anymore.
Thank you, Brother Ethan. As you noticed, I don't quite do things the same from week to week. Sometimes we get into a rut of doing things the same way, and I do like a little variety and changing things up. There's nothing wrong with tradition as long as tradition is scriptural, and actually Bible class is not worship, it's study, all right? A lot of argument in the church around the turn of the 1900s about was Bible class worship? Was it not worship? And the question was certainly answered. J.D. Tant was one of the leaders in that one. However, I'm glad you're here, and it shows certainly an interest in your attitude toward the Word of God. I'm thankful for the visitors here today. As I mentioned, my name is Tim Fisher, and we have been studying Hebrews, and let's finish chapter 4 today and move on to chapter 5. Yes, I have a little bit newer electronics here today to use, so it might be writing a little bit on the screen. So let's finish chapter 4. I'm going to start with chapter 4:14 also. Seeing that we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace and help in time of need. That is New King James Version. We had discussed this idea of Jesus as a trailblazer in chapter 2. We had discussed that a trailblazer is similar to a pioneer, somebody who goes first. Certainly in our nation, there were pioneers who went out west first, and others followed them. And it is the same with Jesus. He is our trailblazer who has went through the heavens up into the presence of God. Because he has passed through the heavens, and last week we had discussed this Jewish concept of heavens, that there were two Jewish people and to Jewish Christians, three heavens. Paul speaks this way in 2 Corinthians, the skies, the universe, and heaven itself. And Jesus has passed through these heavens into the presence of God, and the author of Hebrews is implying that all the high priests in the Old Testament, including Aaron, that Christians are greater than all of them. All right. Now, in chapter 3, Moses, the chapter regarding the syncresis of Christ versus Moses, it was implied that Jesus was greater than Moses. And later on, we're going to see the syncresis of Jesus being greater than the Old Testament high priest, specifically Aaron. You know, perhaps some of the Hebrew Christians, remember they are under persecution and they are being tempted that they may revert back to Judaism, that maybe they felt like they needed an earthly high priest. We had talked about in context that if this was indeed written before AD 70 and specifically AD 66, that there was a lot of resentment of the Jewish ethnic group against the Roman Empire, and this would culminate in the Jewish Revolution, from 66 to 70 AD. Now, Jesus ascended through the heavens, and he accomplished this trailblazer aspect in that he is in the presence of God once and for all. Now, in 4:15, it states that Jesus can sympathize. Now, the word sympathize, and this has been sympatheo, has been transliterated into English, means literally to suffer with a person. And it's another one of these hapax legomenoi. There are a lot of unique words to Hebrews that we call these hapax legomenoi. And this is one of them. Sympatheo. And it's only used here in 1034. Now, sometimes we confuse sympathy and empathy. For instance, my parents have passed away, and many of yours have also. However, when people come up to you and tell you that they are sorry, they understand what's going on, nobody can really understand what it's like to lose a parent unless they've lost a parent, okay? That is just a fact. I mean, you can sympathize, which means you try to understand the situation and someone's struggles, but empathy is a more correct interpretation. And where somebody can empathize with you, they've been in the same struggles, okay? If you were in bankruptcy and somebody told you they knew how you felt and they had never been in bankruptcy, they wouldn't know how you felt. Only somebody who's been in perhaps a bankruptcy could understand that. The loss of a spouse. Who can understand that except somebody who's lost a spouse, okay? So it's more of a correct interpretation, perhaps, or translation, to use the word empathy. And that is exactly, we talked about using different English translations, and that is exactly what is used in the NIV is the word empathy instead of sympathize, all right? Now, it states that Jesus sympathizes with our weaknesses. I'm in the medical field, and we still use the word asthenia, which means a weakness, okay? It would be like somebody having advanced lung disease, somebody we would refer to as COPD, but they have this chronic weakness, asthenia, okay? And that's the Greek word here, asthenia. It's weakness. It could be mental weakness. It could be physical weaknesses. You know, a lot of people think that Jesus, as deity, was out of touch with human weaknesses. But understand that Jesus came to earth as a man, all right, and he was human for a period of time. And as Solomon says, there's nothing new under the sun. Jesus would have been exposed to the same temptations that we are. Temptation in itself is not sinful. However, when you yield to it, that is sinful. So it states in several other passages in the New Testament that Jesus as a man was tempted in every way as we are, but never sinned. And as I mentioned, it's the author's position that if Jesus had sinned, he would not be qualified to be our high priest. Jesus' sacrifice was once and for all, and unlike the Old Testament high priest, he never had to sacrifice for himself because he was perfect. The Old Testament high priest, when he went into the tabernacle and later the temple on the Day of Atonement, would first have to sacrifice for himself, correct? And the sins of himself and his family, then he could be able to sacrifice for the sins of the people. Now, in 4:16, closing the chapter, it states that we are to boldly come to the throne of grace, or let us draw near, as the NIV and ESV would say. And it's used 7 times throughout Hebrews. The New King James Version says, come, and so let us draw near. The phrase is referring to, it's sacrificial talk, okay? It's terminology related to sacrifices. When you are drawing near in the Old Testament, you are coming to the tabernacle, or you are coming to the temple to either worship or bring a sacrifice. So that is what the term draw near means in the Old Testament vernacular. Now, as we mentioned, Jesus had passed through the heavens and entered into the presence of God, and we can draw near ourselves through the sacrifice of Jesus and his presence in heaven. We're not offering a sacrifice. Jesus has already done that. He's done it for everyone. So how do Christians draw near to God? I mean, we obviously here are not having some kind of supernatural, miraculous experience where we're directly in the presence of God talking to him. Our way of talking to God or offering prayers, okay? And the exhortation here is that we draw near to God through Christ by prayer. Understand that it states that Jesus is in the presence of God. He's seated next to him on the right side. It's that place of honor. Understand this is not literal, okay? This is the place of honor. Jesus is not, he's spirit. God is spirit. Okay, when you're seated next to God, it's a metaphor, okay? So Jesus is seated next to God, and he is your intercessor for your prayers reaching God, all right? You have to believe that God is going to take care of you, and God providentially is going to help me out in my life. There have been times, if you've lived long enough, where there does not seem to be an answer to what you're going through. All of us, if we are not a hermit and we live in this life, are going to have situations where there doesn't seem to be what we would call an out. Okay, what's an answer to my problem? And it is in times that prayer is most necessary. You have to turn to God in prayer. And it talks about the Holy Spirit interceding for you sometimes if you don't know what to say. I mean, are there times where you cannot put your problems into words? And the Holy Spirit, part of the Godhead, is helpful in that aspect, all right? There are certainly people who are more eloquent than others. Somebody should be more eloquent teaching this class, probably. However, the entire Godhead is involved, okay? And you can see from Hebrews that the writer is certainly what we would call a Trinitarian. He believes in the three persons of the Godhead, three individual personalities in one essence, okay? And people have difficulty with that concept. However, we can come to the throne of God and stand there in the presence of God through prayer, and we can have this boldness, this complete confidence because of the intercessory work of our high priest, Jesus Christ. And we're blessed with prayer. Judaism in itself could never cleanse somebody's conscience. Remember, in Judaism, there was a kafar, a covering of sins, okay? It can never allow somebody to stand before God. The sacrifice of Jesus can. And understand that God is sitting on a throne of grace, all right? That word grace. Christians are saved by grace. We are saved by grace. That it's this unfavored merit, okay? It's not like in the Old Testament, in the tabernacle and the temple, where God metaphorically would be in the Holy of Holies, where he would be in the mercy seat, okay? Remember that blood would be sprinkled on the altar of incense and on the mercy seat by the high priest for atonement of sins. So understand that these Hebrews are living under the threat of persecution, and they are encouraged, and we are encouraged in turn, to approach God through prayer for help. So why draw near? Note that mercy and grace are dependent upon drawing near through prayer. As we mentioned in the Old Testament, the worshiper had to physically draw near to the tabernacle or temple. So us praying, that is how we obtain mercy and how we obtain grace. All right? And the listener or reader, more likely listener, because we discussed that most people in antiquity were illiterate, they have to approach God with a faithful, obedient heart. And this idea of obedience in Hebrews is huge. So the conclusions of chapter 4. You know, as mentioned in chapter 13, it states that book of exhortation. Not all exhortations are positive. Some are negative. Some are meant to admonish the individual. Some are meant to encourage or exhort the individual. The author suggests, let us do these things to ensure that we can enter the rest. That's what this whole chapter's been about, right? The rest of God, and not fall short of our goal like the wilderness Israelites. And this example of these Israelites in the wilderness is going to be used again and again and again in Hebrews, okay? This is not the last time we're going to see this example used. So, in saying let us, you know, if I was talking to Don Sullivan and I would say let us, I would be saying, you and me, Don, we're going to do this, okay? So when the author says let us, he's including himself in the audience, okay? And he says, let us fear, okay? Verse 1, that reverential fear of God, okay? Let us strive to enter the rest, okay? The heavenly rest. Let us hold fast our confession. That is your initial confession, the confidence you had when you converted to Christianity. And let us draw near, that is this exhortation through prayer, all right? So, in essence, respect God, have this reverential fear of Him, keep the faith, pray for God's assistance, and strive to live a Christian life worthy of entering heaven. Questions on chapter 4? I know I've done most talking, but if anybody has any questions, please feel free to speak up. All right, let's talk about Hebrews chapter 5. Jesus, a better high priest than Aaron. Remember, we've been discussing this syncresis. This picture is a few years old because I don't use any top feeders anymore. I tried that experiment for a year. It was so simple to feed them and just go out there and change it, but you could not keep water from going through that opening. And water in beehives is not a good thing. All right. But you can understand my laziness in trying, right, Larry? Now, this discussion of Jesus as high priest is going to go on through chapter 10, 10:18 to be exact. Now, Lightfoot states that the argument of the author regarding the priesthood of Christ can be divided into 4 parts. 1, Christ is supremely qualified as high priest in that he is compassionate, chosen from among men, and chosen by God. That is the first 10 verses I think my pen died. I can still use my finger. In 1 through 10. Then the author goes on an excursus, which is a lengthy discussion for his readers to progress in maturity. They're rebuked for their immaturity and threatened by the possibility of apostasy. However, they're encouraged to hold on to the end. This will be 5:11 through 6:20. Christ is a high priest. This is the only book in the New Testament that discusses Jesus as our high priest, but not to the order of the Levites. He is a high priest after the order of Melchizedek, which we certainly will discuss. Because he's a high priest like Melchizedek, his sacrifices are far greater than those that were offered under the Mosaic law. That will be chapter 7, and that is a chapter we will spend quite a bit of time on. It seems the author wants to establish 2 points. Jesus fulfills the role as a high priest, and he offered himself for the sins of the audience, and he wants to demonstrate that the Mosaic law was an imperfect system of righteousness, which means making men right with God. And he has to find a priesthood that lies outside the Mosaic Levitical system. And there's only one, and that would be the priesthood of Melchizedek. Melchizedek is only mentioned in 2 times in the Old Testament. And what kind of priest is Melchizedek, especially when you read Psalms 110? He's obviously not a Mosaic priest. Melchizedek lived during the time of Abraham, correct? It would be a long time before the time of Moses that the Mosaic law would be given. So it's a priesthood that predates the Levitical priesthood, all right? And David in Psalms 110 is obviously living under the Mosaic law. He is the second king, remember, after Saul, and still king of the United Kingdom, as we would say. And he's writing up another priesthood outside of the Mosaic law. So as I mentioned, Melchizedek's priesthood predates the Mosaic law and is still in effect when the Mosaic law is in effect. And it's going to be applied to the new covenant. So understand that it predates the Mosaic law and is still in effect during the Mosaic law. The author is then in chapters 8 through 10, and this gets to be tedious to some individuals. He's going to contrast the 2 covenants and present his argument that the ministry of Jesus' priesthood is superior to the Old Testament priesthood. And you can see by his argument that he's planned out exactly what he wants to say. Let's read chapter 5, and I'm going to read, it's not a long chapter. Oh, I lost it. Let's read chapter 5, 1 through 10. There's only 14 verses in this chapter, but it's a deep chapter. And I'm reading from the New King James Version this morning. For every high priest taken from among men is appointed for men in things pertaining to God, that he may offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins. He can have compassion on those who are ignorant and going astray, since he himself is also beset by weakness. Because he is required as for the people, but also for himself to offer for sins. And no man takes this honor to himself, but he who is called by God, just as Aaron was. So also Christ did not glorify himself to become high priest, but it was he who said to him, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." And he also says in another place, "You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek." That is a quotation of Psalms 110. Who in the days of his flesh, when he had offered up prayers and supplications with vehement cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and was heard because of his godly fear. Although he was a son, yet he learned obedience by the things which he suffered. And having been perfected, he became the author of eternal salvation to all who obey him, called by God as high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. All right. I lost connection for a moment. So what was the task of a high priest? And this first section of this chapter is written in what's called a chiastic structure. That was frequently used in antiquity. It would be like, okay, Jesus is being compared to the high priest here. Okay? The high priest is going to have A, B, and C. All right, qualities. Jesus is going to be D, E, and F. Okay? In a chiastic structure, the argument's in the middle. All right? So C and D are the same. B and E are the same, and F and A are the same. Okay? So they're sort of inverse order. 1, 2, 3. 3 is actually 4, and 5 is 2, and 6 is 1. And we'll see that. Now, it states that the function of the high priest in this opening verse of the chapter was to make atonement, all right? And when you are making atonement, you're making amends for sins, okay? It's what it means, on behalf of the people to God. Now, it states that he offers gifts and sacrifices. It's vague. The author is going to be intentionally vague here. And when you say gifts and sacrifices, gifts actually are sacrifices that do not involve blood, okay? Now, there were really only 2 sacrifices that involved blood, okay? One was on the Day of Atonement, and later on we'll see the red heifer sacrifice that was a purification sacrifice. And it was done by the high priest too. However, there were certainly sacrifices that did not involve blood either. There were grain offerings, there were heave offerings, there were wave offerings, okay? There are sacrifices that the high priest would do that did not involve blood. So gifts and sacrifices, one involving blood, one not. Now, it states that the high priest must be selected among men, okay? So, from among men. And not only, and the author doesn't get into that he's got to be a Levite, and not all Levites were from priestly classes, correct? So, and the author doesn't even say he's got to be a Hebrew, okay? So he's being deliberately vague, but he just says he's selected from among men. That's pretty broad and vague. So basically, he's human, and he's the representative to God. And it states that he must have compassion, okay? This word compassion, we saw this in 4:15, where it states that we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize. The word here is a word play on the word in 4:15, okay? This high priest, this man, must have compassion. And remember that there's no chapter breaks in antiquity, okay? So chapter 5 is a continuation of the thoughts of chapter 4. So there's a word play on the word sympatheo, okay? Instead of sympatheo or compassion, it's another one of these unique words to Hebrews, which is matreo patheo, okay? And this is a word play on the word that was used in verse 4:15, sympatheo. It's not the same word. So when the word matreo patheo is used, it means that you are moderating emotions, okay? Such as anger. You're keeping your passions under control. I have a great respect for people that can, quote, keep their cool under unusual circumstances, okay? That somebody is in, as we would say, in their face. It takes a lot of moderation on your part not to resort back. That's what this is referring to, okay? That you're keeping your emotions under control. Not that you might not raise your tone somewhat, okay? However, you are being considerate and reasonable under the circumstances. Now, if you look at the translation of the ESV and NASB and NIV, states that he can deal gently. And that really doesn't make any sense, okay, to us at the moment. that I'm going to deal gently with the ignorant, okay? And having compassion, really, the New King James translation, doesn't really catch the meaning either. So understand it's a moderation of emotions in keeping your compassions under control. So understand that the high priest is capable of representing the ignorant. And when we say ignorant, it's not the intelligence, okay? Ignorant means committing sins perhaps that you did not realize, okay? There's a difference in Hebrews between ignorant sins and sinning willfully. And we're going to see that later on in this book. Sinning willfully is a rebellious spirit that the Hebrews author states that leads to apostasy. All right? However, there are people that certainly sin ignorantly. We do things we do not realize, and we don't mean to, that just because we're weak individuals. All right? So the high priest himself is also ignorant. He's done the same thing. And it's why he offers this sacrifice initially for himself and family, then for the people. And it's what makes him a good high priest. He understands why he's doing it. So it's good in the aspect that he recognizes that he is a sinful person. It's bad in the aspect in that he is a sinful person. All right? And the author, during his argument regarding the high priest, is going to argue that only Jesus can fulfill this idea of an ideal high priest because Jesus is sinless. He made the perfect sacrifice. He never sinned. The high priests are, as it states, they're divinely authorized. They are called by God. That is, God selected who was going to serve as high priest. And he cites the example of Aaron being appointed high priest. Remember that it was Moses who ordained Aaron as a priest. God is going to select him as high priest. Now, you cannot take this honor on your own, it states. You don't, in those days, it was against the will of God for you to declare yourself high priest. There had to be a genealogy that was from Aaron, okay, and there had to be a ethnic background that you're a Levite, Hebrew, and so you just couldn't come in there from any tribe if you're from the tribe of Zebulun and say, I'm high priest. It would be like somebody nowadays saying, I am the President of the United States, all right? You don't go out and make that statement because obviously you can't support it and it's a false statement, okay? You cannot take the honor for yourself. And the author understands that he's not talking about contemporary times. If you look at the Hellenistic, when I say Hellenistic, I am referring from the time of Alexander the Great, from 323 roughly, until 63 BC, Hellenistic, Greek influence, and then Roman rule. There was, the high priest was up for biddership, okay? So whoever bid the most was considered high priest. And that was the trouble with the New Testament high priest. I mean, you didn't know if he was truly qualified, okay? I mean, Caiaphas was high priest when Jesus was crucified. Was Caiaphas from the Levitical background? Okay. Was he truly qualified? He was actually the son-in-law of Annas, okay? And Annas had been removed from power from the Romans because of he took it on his own to execute somebody, Okay, only the Romans had the power of capital punishment, but was not the job of high priest a lifetime job? Correct? You were for a lifetime? Okay. And so it's not like the Romans really could make the change from a religious viewpoint. So Caiaphas really wasn't qualified in the first place to be high priest. So the author's not going to develop any of these points. He wants to develop the point of what makes a good high priest. And he doesn't have any of these interest in contemporary practices, as we mentioned. Now, as we mentioned, this is a chiastic structure, and so Jesus had to be human, right? He's chosen from among men, all right? So if God is spirit, if Christ is spirit, he had to become man to become high priest, okay? So he's going to have the exact same qualifications in inverse order. But you need to notice that he's now referred to as the Christ, okay? And remember we discussed that the word Christ is a position. It's a title, okay? Means the anointed one. So he has divine authorization from God. Remember, the earthly high priest was appointed by God, describes his personal character, and like the earthly high priest that was sinful, Jesus was sinless, and what his function is in verses 9 through 10. All right. So Jesus can serve as our high priest since he lived as a human being. Now, the author is going to quote 2 Old Testament passages, and I would tell you, go back and study these, because these quotations from Psalms 2:7 and Psalms 110 are going to be used over and over again in Hebrews, okay? Multiple times. So they represent God the Father. Remember, the Hebrews author is reappropriating this to refer to Jesus, all right? And when we talked about reappropriation, we're taking previous prophecy or writing and applying it to Jesus. And so God the Father speaking to God the Son, okay? Remember that Son means characteristics of, okay? So 2 parts of the Godhead. Jesus was begotten. Now, a lot of people get confused on this term, all right? Nothing to get confused about. Jesus was brought about to be a man by God the Father, okay? So it's miraculous, okay? So this begotten from spirit to man, all right? So even though Jesus was deity, it states that he did not take the high priesthood for himself. God appointed Jesus high priest. And Psalms 2:7 is going to be used to prove this point, okay? You are my son, today I have begotten you. In Psalms 110, you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. All right? So here again, the author is reappropriating Old Testament scripture to refer to Jesus, and God declares Jesus as a high priest forever. Okay? And this role as Jesus as high priest, as we mentioned, is going to be discussed through chapter 10, verse 18. Now, it states in 5:7, Jesus' compassion. It states, in the days of his flesh. Now, if you say in the days of his flesh, it really implies that there was a pre-flesh existence, does it not? It would be like me saying, in the days of his, what am I trying to say? Advanced age, trying to say not real old, but I mean at some time you were younger, okay? All right. So there are days of his flesh, so there's a pre-flesh existence of Jesus, obviously. Now, in discussing these personal qualities of Jesus as high priest, it states that he offered prayers and supplications to God. Understand, Jesus is man, all right? Deity coming to earth in human form, flesh, as it's referred to. And it's probably a reference to Jesus' prayer at Gethsemane and prayers on the cross. Now, if you look at the words that are used here, deesis, it means to beg or plead. And obviously, the scenario of Jesus praying at Gethsemane was that he was begging and pleading. Hikataria means the supplication that you're humbly requesting another. Now it states that Jesus was extremely vocal. There are loud cries and tears. And this is even itself not mentioned in the Gospels. He's under severe mental distress. Remember that he was perhaps sweating and there were blood that was coming through the pores also. He prayed to God to save him from death. Now, it basically means not from death, but out of death, okay? The whole plan of Jesus coming to earth was to die for our sins. And so the plan is not for God the Father to save him from dying, but he is to save him out of death, okay? And this obviously is an allusion to the resurrection. So Jesus didn't pray to God to keep him from dying. He prayed to God to rescue him from it, okay? Remember that he is in this paradise, okay, and to rescue him from death. Now, in 5:8, it states that Jesus had to learn obedience. Though he was a son, yet he learned obedience by the things which he suffered. Now, Jesus is deity. He's part of the Godhead. And it seems confusing to us that Jesus is going to learn something, okay? Is not Jesus omnipotent, unlimited power, able to do anything? Yes, but can God limit his abilities? Yes, okay. Deity can limit what they want to do. So Jesus becomes human, and obviously there are things that Jesus experienced as a human that he has passion and emotion. And I'm out of time. We'll pick up here next week. Thank you.